Hello, welcome to my presentation on the impact of digitalization on records management in the Norwegian public sector. My name is Daniel Hagen, and I'm a PhD student at OsloMet University. I have a background in e-government and privacy and information security with a master's thesis from the University of Oslo. I've been doing this for about 1.5 years now, and noticed pretty quickly that I had to split the topic of impact on digitalization on records management into several parts. First of all, there's the question of what these public records are actually used for. Of course, there's a huge potential in records, and there are talks in this conference that are much better suited to discuss these potentials than my talk is. In the context of my research, the main focus is not on what the records are used for, but the fact that they are available and can be used at all. Of course, there's still the point about what kind of value these records can have for the individual, and particularly the citizens being able to claim their rights in the face of a big, powerful government is a central point here. But there's more. There's also the topic of cultural outreach. I mean the cultural heritage part, like music, photos, films. Some of my interview subjects highlighted the possibilities digitalization can provide for this communication and enabling the use of cultural records such as musical works and photographs. There was this one example of people sitting on a dock. Using Google Maps or whatever, planning their traveling route, tourists in Norway, and being able to look at historical photographs from the spot they're sitting at, looking at how a central ferry pier looked 50 years ago, what kind of music the local violinist composed while sitting on this actual dock of the bay. There are, I'll return a bit more to this later. There's also some technical opportunities provided and a key part of digitalization, which, as I mentioned here, goes straight into efficiency, saving money, and these questions. And the one of the important parts here is automation and otherwise simplification of routine tasks like specifically Freedom of Information Act requests that can take a lot of time, and using automation of these tasks to free up resources to actually work on developing kinds of tools for communication and dissemination, like mentioned earlier, which is at least for now just a thought and an idea, and not really what records management professionals can spend most of their time developing. I'll get back to how this has actually worked in practice and whether the records management professionals and their colleagues have had time freed up from automation. There's also a question in my research of shared responsibility in records management. There's a huge number of municipalities in Norway, and because of some legal quirks, actually a pretty big deal, but not something I'll go into here. These municipalities are self-governed to a large degree. They naturally cooperate between themselves and with the federal government by transferring data and using each other's systems for processing data, especially federally controlled systems. And this brings up the question of who's actually responsible when records are created for this management of the records, and for every other legal obligation connected to the processing of data, which I'm not going to be focusing on in my research. The Gdpr, which most of you probably have heard about by now, is relatively comprehensive. It stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, by the way, and it's a legal framework from the EU, binding all its member states and Norway as well, and a couple of others. And the GDPR is relatively comprehensive in its obligation for what it calls the shared responsibility of data processing, but there's still the question of if equipped to handle these situations in records management, and what other laws apply here. This point in my research is not fully explored yet. It's going to be more of a focus down the line. And third, there's the topic of privacy. I've summarized this with 3 concepts, probably better known from information security, partially because of my background, I think. These are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. There are several aspects to these. One's the familiar point of not allowing records to fall into the hands of the wrong people, or confidentiality. You're supposed to be able to control your own information even in the world of records management. And this data is not supposed to be changed, deleted, whatever, used without your consent. And if it is incorrect, you should be able to change it. This concerns the integrity of the data. Another point, which is more applicable in my research, is the point of availability. The possibility of accessing your own records or letting others with a need and a good reason to access them as well. This is what I refer to as availability. And this, I think this is often forgotten when you talk about privacy, but it's just important as people who aren't supposed to get access to them, not getting access to them. So I'm researching what kind of risks for privacy does digitalization entail, and what kind of possibilities does it bring for us in the world of records management. And I want to talk a little bit more about why I've chosen to bring up the topic of privacy in this records management research. So there are a lot of possible topics that come into play when discussing records and digitalization, as if they weren't already interesting enough on their own. But in my research, I'm mainly looking at the part privacy plays here, partially because of my own interests and background, and partially because of the enormous amount of attention that privacy got with GDPR that came into play 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. Time flies by. I know this is a topic of discussion on its own, but records are in this context documents, and documents often contain data. When this data is about a single person or several people for that matter, privacy comes into play. The core concept is that you are the owner of your own personal data. This is the core concept of information privacy in general. You are entitled to it being protected from other people and being able to access it yourself. Linking back to what I said about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. There are lots of interesting concepts that clash with records management here, like deletion and editing of this data. But this is usually taken care of in more specific laws, often with records being exempt from some of the usual rights that privacy entails. The value of records is also a huge topic on its own, but in my research, I want to shed some light on the value of records for the individual. In this situation, this often comes up in cases where there's a long time since the wrong has been done, such as adults who, when they were children, received inadequate health or dental care, or inadequate support and compensation from their schools due to learning difficulties and such. To be able to claim these rights and right the wrongs that were done, an individual needs proof. In a case of the individual's word versus the state's word, the individual will more often than not lose again. Digitalization brings with it a lot of challenges for privacy. Just think about marketing and social media as the foremost example, which is pretty popular topic of criticisms when it comes to social media. But it also does bring with it a lot of possibilities, such as the easy access to your own data, records concerning you. This should be an important aspect of the digitalization of records management, the actual availability of this data. And I'm sure you can see how this directly relates to protecting the individual's privacy rights, both in the case of being able to access your data, which is a right in its own, and being able to access your data to right any wrongs done to your privacy by, say, the state or private organizations. As a topic of my research, there is still much to be done here, and in the future I hope to research how these municipalities and statewide organizations have made records accessible for citizens and how this can help them maintain their privacy. But I think it's time to go over to my actual research and findings, what I've done so far. And I'm going to start out with a little background information that illustrates why this is important and what I'm actually researching. So enter Norwegian digitalization. Digitalization has been a part of politics for a long time, but it's difficult to decide on a clear starting point. There's not an obvious before and after. The first circular letter on digitalization was published in 2009 here in Norway, which is a letter from the Ministry of Local Government and Modernization. It was called something else back then. They keep changing their names. But the letter was meant to clarify and bring attention to good practices and the legal obligations other governmental organizations and municipalities had in relation to digitalization. Since 2009, this letter has been updated and published yearly. And one probably shouldn't talk about digitalization without considering the Norwegian welfare systems, both historically and as it is today. Much of the digitalization, as well as history of Norway, Norwegian politics in general, seeks to better the welfare system and is based on this social security system. Be it in the cases of digitalization, it can be faster processing or simplifying communication with the public administration for the citizens. The goals there are some goals stated in the newest circular letter, which can be found repeated in the more overarching strategy for digitalization, which is also a document published by the Norwegian government. And the goals stated in this letter are innovation, simplification, and improvement. And these are not just end goals in themselves. Rather, they should be seen as prerequisites for better and more efficient access to the welfare system. Simplification means that more people can fill out their own applications, do the required work themselves. Caseworkers won't have to spend as much time with relatively simple procedures and be able to focus on the ones that are actually complicated, which can also lead to caseworkers being able to focus their time and energy on innovation and improvement. So this can be something as simple as simplifying the wording of legal documents that you as a user have to know the contents of. It can be as simple as removing unnecessary questions from forms you have to fill out to get Social Security benefits. Removing the free text boxes and stuff like that. As I've gathered from my interviews, a lot of the caseworkers inevitably end up as experts in their respective systems, but they do not have the time to enable them to use their skills and creativity in developing improved solutions. Simplification and automation, which I'll get back to later, should hopefully be able to help with this. Another important aspect of digitalization is the focus on user centricity. As I've written down here, user-centric approach, often called user orientation, at least when you're talking to Norwegians, has something of a different focus than the welfare system in general. Whereas the welfare system has been categorized as a public good for society as a whole, the user centricity depicts an individualized concern for the well-being of specific users of public services. So not just the good of all, but for the benefit of every single citizen. The welfare system is often focused on a social good, and the fact that people having economical safety nets enable them to take business risks that can pay off, or just makes it easier for them to get back into work. Spending the needed time on rehabilitation or whatever. But this concept of user centricity revolves more around the individual users. The systems should work better for each and every person, and the experience of the users when applying for welfare or otherwise communicating with the state administration should be as smooth and user-friendly as possible. This way of going about things, as I said, depicts an individualized concern for the well-being of specific users of public services. User centricity also involves some more technical aspects, such as involving users in the developing of systems and processes, by using things such as use case stories and focusing on the actual needs of the users. And I'll return to this very shortly. So, how have these goals actually been achieved in practice? As I mentioned just now, there are these stated goals of innovation, simplification, and improvement. But how achievable is this for the records management professional? In the course of my research, I have interviewed a number of professionals, both from smaller municipalities and from larger statewide organizations. There generally seems to be a hopeful and positive attitude towards digitalizations. Some subjects mention that making routine tasks like freedom of information requests easier, maybe even automating them, would free up time that could be used on things like conservation and other records work. These routine tasks often seem to be shared relatively equally amongst the records management employees, although some people are hired for conservation of photographs, musical pieces, while others might be hired as administrators for school records and dentistry records, and the latter will then inevitably receive more requests for these routine tasks, such as freedom of information requests. User centricity seems to be an important aspect for many of the records management workers I've talked to, both in a practical and ideological sense. At least one of the interviewed subjects mentioned specifically that they need to remind themselves who they exist for the benefit of, and that they can assure the citizens get wrongs righted with their help and documentation. This broad overarching idea generally seems to be shared by the people I have interviewed. Another more practical aspect is the actual involvement of users in the development of systems and processes. The amount this is actually done seems to vary a great deal. There are a number of reasons for this. One subject told me about how they don't use use cases and user stories because it simply takes up too much time. There's a clear limitation when it comes to resources. Not necessarily in the form of money. Some subjects told me that this isn't really a concern for them, but the resource is lacking in the case of human resources. And records management professionals need to prioritize what they do with their time. This is another resource that is often lacking: time. When developing new systems, there are deadlines to meet, and people in charge expect working systems, even though they might not be as good as they could be. The involvement of the users can then get cut either completely or to a minimum. And these degrees of user centricity seem to vary. Some subjects talk about how they work on simplifying application forms and such, for example, allowing citizens to reuse data from previous year's application when they need to provide new ones. Some mention the possibilities of use case scenarios in the development of these, but there does not seem to be much concrete work being done on this. This might also be because records management professionals work in a relatively niche area in their businesses, and people from other departments might have more experience, time, and resources dedicated to developmental tools, such as use case scenarios and the like. Some of my subjects also mention that, for example, when buying off-the-shelf systems, money is a much more important factor than the user centricity of systems. One subject said that they suspected that the initial cost was much more important than the operating costs. Others operate differently and could tell me about how they made use of user stories and gathered people from relevant areas and focused on their needs. One subject said that their starting point was the actual needs of the users, and from there they could figure out what kind of system they needed. This subject said that the focus is often not on what the users say they want, but what they actually need. And this is a relatively detailed focus on user centricity that shows that some have definitely come further than others. And there seems to be several upsides to this way of working, including a project group that works well together and know what they need when meeting with possible suppliers of system, because you've already decided before meeting the actual suppliers what you're after and what you're going to need. And lastly, on this topic, I'll talk a little bit about the freeing of resources from routine tasks, allowing people to spend their time working on other things, such as innovation and improvement. Automation can be an important tool here, and is generally an important part of digitalization. Can be used for such things as automating the processing of applications for welfare, like paying cases of sick leave or parental leave. And this is an interesting topic in itself, and how far we can go in automating decisions that affect a person's life and welfare should indeed be a topic for discussion. Because there are obviously some cases are a lot more cut and dry than others. There are some cases where you have a very complicated sickness, which doesn't really lend itself to just yes or no questions or binary factors in general. And removing the human factor here can have consequences. Nevertheless, automation can be an important tool for freeing resources that can be used for the innovation and improvement. Some subjects talked about the importance of good, correct data when trying to automate systems, which in turn necessitates quality control of public registers, and this can entail a lot of work. One subject that worked in software development mentioned that they do wish to automate to free up resources, but that when routine tasks are automated, the caseworkers who used to do them now instead have to work on improvement and quality controlling these systems, not enabling them to fulfill the goals of innovation as much as might be wanted. Automating tasks such as freedom of information requests help towards the goal of being open and transparent, which is an important goal in itself, but it does not necessarily free up time and resources because of the increase in these requests for the public, now that there are easily available tools to help them with these requests. Though there seems to be a general opinion that automation is increasing, and this is freeing up time, even if this hasn't fully matured, especially in the cases of innovation and improvement quite yet. So that's a lot of information and difficult to sum up in just a few sentences. There are naturally varied experiences amongst records management professionals. I'll talk a little bit about these experiences, such as involvement in the shaping of policy. And often these experiences vary depending on if the subjects work in smaller municipalities or larger statewide organizations. At the same time, there is, of course, a lot of variation between municipalities. Some of them have this particular focus on local culture and history, which I talked a little bit about earlier, where some of my interviewed subjects had this idea about using the digitalization and the resources they have the possibility of freeing up to develop new possibilities for communicating all these exciting records that they have, such as making musical pieces available for the use in sampling, or making photographs available for the purpose of comparing how things look now compared to how they looked before. Other municipalities have their hands more full with routine tasks of answering freedom of information requests and administrating their own records. And an interesting question is how records management professionals are involved in the shaping of policy and laws that govern their work. And as far as my research goes, the subject seems to agree that they are not very involved. Some say that they get the opportunity, such as in legal hearings, but don't have the resources to actually respond to these in a very detailed way. And the people I interviewed that were not actual records management professionals, but rather worked in software development and the like, seem to view records management as something of a marginalized group that didn't really have a say in the shaping of policy. According to these subjects, the records management professionals were more than willing to help find solutions to problems and work with software developers when needed, but they were not consulted about how records management should be integrated into systems in anything but the cases where it was absolutely necessary. And the records management software is almost always an integration that is added onto other business systems, and very rarely something that is part of the design from the very start. This makes the concept of user centricity very difficult when it comes to records management systems, because it is hardly being developed on its own at all, but rather treated as a necessary add-in to business systems. So, to attempt a conclusion, digitalization brings a lot of exciting possibilities for the records management professionals and could allow them to simplify some tasks and focus on others, allowing them to fulfill the goals of innovation, simplification, and improvement. But the field is not being prioritized and not involved in decision making that could speed up and simplify this work with digitalization. So although there's been done work and there are a lot of possibilities, it doesn't really seem like we're seeing the full benefits of this quite yet. That's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for watching, and feel free to contact me if you have any thoughts, questions, opinions, and criticisms on what I've been talking about. Thank you very much.